Chinese medicine has been for me the fulfillment of a search for a congenial system of healing. It is a personal, subtle, gentle, yet highly technical medical system which allows me to be close to the essence, to the life force, both of my own and that of others. It's a masterpiece of harmony, intricacy, and movement, which never ceases to engage me, never ceases to fascinate me and intrigue me. Then people did studies on animals, dogs and cats, in which they did videos of these animals during the day when I don't know who owns who, left and went to work, and how they would get up maybe a half hour or 45 minutes from whatever place they were sleeping and go to the window or the door and sit and wait. And the person was just leaving work. They hadn't quite left work. This was consistent. And there are movies of this sort of thing, books about it. And then I had another experience. I went to live in London for a period of time where I discovered Chinese medicine. And while I was living there, I was living in a community, and there was a woman living in this community who was a Catholic nun. On weekends, she went back to the convent where she was a teacher. She taught history. But during the week, she lived in this community. And she had a dog. The dog was named Jason. He was a combination that the British had invented of a German Shepherd and a Collie. And as you can imagine, this was a huge dog. This dog followed her everywhere. She lived on the second floor. I lived on the first. This dog slept outside of her room. He would have nothing to do with anybody else. You couldn't, I mean, he was not a threat to anybody, but he was just not interested in anybody except her. And wherever she went, he went. One day, and she and I became very close friends. She had a tremendous influence on me spiritually. And one day we were in another part of London, and we're taking a taxi back to this community. And it was about a 15, 20-minute ride. And she sat on one part of the taxi and I was on the other. These are English taxis, are very different from ours. And she leaned forward, and she was not a very talkative person. The British aren't. They're very, laconic. And she leaned forward and she said, she said, I can't take Jason with me anymore back to the convent. The convent won't allow me to have a dog because they say they've got too many dogs. And so I'm not allowed to keep Jason. And I was about a few weeks from going back to the United States. I'd been there 6 months. And she said, would you consider taking Jason with you back to the United States? Because I can't keep her here anymore. So I said, well, at that time I was married to a woman who was, I would call an earth mother. She loved little things, children, animals. We had 7 cats and 2 dogs at that time, or 8 cats, I can't remember. And everybody dropped their children off for whatever reason. I had a 6,000 square foot house. This was that little house that I had morphed into a 6,000 square foot house. And so it was filled with small furry things or children, and they had their own part. The 6,000 square foot house had a part for children. The children had their own house. So I said, I think that my wife would be more than happy to have another living thing running around. But I'm pretty sure, so I think, there won't be any problem. We got back within 15 or 20 minutes to this community. And when you opened the door, my room was immediately after you entered on the left. And we opened the door, and lying outside of my door was Jason. And from that moment on, Jason would have nothing to do with her. Slept outside my door and followed me everywhere. So there are ways of knowing that don't fit into our ordinary logic. Ways that I think little children have. I think we have it when we're born and when the first year or two of life. We know a lot about the people around us that doesn't come from books. And so I think that heart, mind, balances. And Einstein wrote about this in a number of different ways because he knew about it. It informed him. It's something I think that's inherent in all mammals, at any rate, all living things. I can't be sure of other kinds of living things, but I suspect that it's true for everything. This heart-mind is the original way of knowing. And how the kidney brain developed, I'm not intelligent enough or smart enough to know how this all worked out. But what I do know is that they both exist. I've experienced both of them personally, as well as through these animals. And I can tell you about a cat. I'm sure you're tired of hearing about animals, but I had a cat when I was in medical school. I went to Cornell University and Cornell Medical College, and she was a little kitten, and I called her Cornelia. That cat and the woman I was married to at that time did not get along. My wife was very jealous because I loved that cat. And the cat slept with me at night. When my wife went to sleep, the cat would jump up and slept the rest of the night with me. But I lived in a 5-story walk-up when I was going to medical school on First Avenue in New York. And when my wife was out, the cat would come out, we'd play games with each other, throwing a... Those days there was a little thing called a handball, and the floor sloped, and I'd throw it up, and it would roll down, and she'd lie out and would not look and just hit it, and we had a lot of fun. At any rate, the minute my wife opened the door, 5 flights down, I could tell when my wife was coming. This cat became alert and disappeared. And you did not see that cat again as long as my wife was in that apartment. And she knew when she came in, 5 flights down. Then my wife became jealous because I had this cat. She wanted a cat of her own. So there was a pet store downstairs, and I said, well, why don't you go down and find a cat in there and bring it home, and that would be fine. And so she went down, and she was gone for about 4 hours, and I got a phone call from the owner of the shop, and he said, would you please come down? There's somebody here I understand you're married to who's driving me crazy, and I would appreciate it if you come down and resolve things. So I went down, and we picked out this magnificently beautiful male cat. Cornelia was a female. And we called him Dennis the Menace. I don't know if you ever heard of Dennis the Menace. It was a cartoon character. And he was a little tiny kitten, and what went on between them was a lot of fun. Ultimately, they cohabitated and produced kittens. Everybody wanted their kittens. But we kept one. And when I was finished in medical school, and then went through my internship in the Bronx, we lived downstairs in a basement apartment. And at any rate, when I started my residency, I had to move back to Manhattan. And all the apartments there were very, very small. And as an intern, I made $1 a day. As a resident, I think, working every day and weekends, I made like $2,500, I think, for the year. At any rate, I couldn't afford very much. And so we got this very small apartment, and my wife suddenly said she didn't want Dennis the Menace anymore. I had to get rid of him. I had to get rid of him. And she refused to move into that apartment if Dennis the Menace went. She preferred his son, one of the kittens that we kept. So at that time, in addition to doing my residency, I had a cousin who was married to a doctor up in the Bronx. And in those days, doctors did night calls, went to people's houses. And he was getting on, and he didn't want to do these night calls anymore. So in addition to working all day as a resident, I worked for him all night, from midnight to 8 a.m., taking his night calls in the Bronx. And so I didn't know what to do with Dennis the Menace. And he had somebody who cleaned his office. And so she was a black woman, and I asked her if she wanted a cat. And she said, yeah, I'd love to have a cat. So I introduced her to Dennis the Menace, who really became this magnificently beautiful animal, huge. And so she lived way up in the north part of the Bronx. So I drove all the way up to her apartment and delivered Dennis the Menace to her. About 6 weeks later, I got a call from this woman. She said, you have to come and take Dennis the Menace away. Because, first of all, when I come home, he's never there. And when I'm not home, he does very unpleasant things on my pillow. So I had to drive all the way back up to the northern part of the Bronx. And she came to the door, opened the door. And as soon as she opened the door, I said, well, where's Dennis the Menace? She said, I have no idea. I never see him. And I suddenly heard this wail, this cry, this almost inhuman cry, come from somewhere inside her apartment. And so I followed the sound, and out from under this old-fashioned bathtub that was on feet up off the ground came Dennis the Menace. He came out, and he leaped onto my chest and dug his nails in. And from that point on, and I drove him all the way back down to Lower Manhattan. While I was driving, Dennis the Menace clung to my chest, buried his head in my chest, and wouldn't let go. Now, I hadn't seen that cat for 6 weeks. He didn't even see me. All I did was ring the bell and she opened the door. And we had a couple of words of conversation at the door. And that cat, far more than any dog I ever had, was attached to me. And I had no idea about that. So these are things, and I could go on with them. Things that children know that have to do not with the brain, but come from the heart. And so there is this heart-mind, and it's essentially, in my way of thinking about the heart, which I wrote about in a book I wrote, first book I wrote, it's one part of the heart which is, in a sense, illogical, from which all creativity comes. When Rodin, the great sculptor, said that when he, I think it was him, or maybe it was one of the ones during the Renaissance, who said when they look at a piece of stone, they don't see the stone, they see the statue. And that is what all creativity is about. That's, what all art is about. That's whatever I hear people tell me they're doing with their patients. That has nothing to do with anything they could have figured out. I used to try and spent one day a week going over each of my patients, deciding what I thought was wrong and what I would do about it. But I found that the minute I walked into the room where they were, everything changed. And I suddenly saw something entirely different and did something entirely different. And if one thing didn't work, something else came to me. And had nothing, I think doing that brain work is very important. But what actually evolves comes from some other place. And all art is that way. But the heart has these 4 parts that I mentioned. One part, which we call yin, is the creative energy that comes out of the collective unconscious that has no real order to it. But there's the yang part of the heart, which is the part that sees, that is able to take that vision, what Rodin or the other great sculptor, I can't think of his name, saw in that rock. That is the part of the heart that can actually chisel away and actually make that statue. So first you have to have the vision, and then you have to have that ability to actually put that vision into some kind of concrete form, whether it's a painting, a poem, a picture, an invention, an acupuncture treatment. It's a necessary part in terms of your being a human being, because if you just have the vision and you don't have the ability to put it into some kind of form that other human beings can recognize, you're going to go crazy. Because ultimately our sanity depends on our connection with other human beings. It's how that other people see us and hear us and so on that form who we are. So it's necessary to have that other part that actually puts your vision into some kind of form that can communicate with other people so that other people recognize you, see you. Now, the other part of the heart is what anybody who's ever created anything, and I discovered when I wrote my first book, is that as soon as you create something, somebody's going to be jealous. You need other human beings. You need that contact in order, as I put it, to stay intact. But other human beings take different forms. Some of them are very supportive, and some of them are very destructive. So the heart needs another part, which we call the pericardium. If you know in anatomy, the pericardium is the covering of the heart. It protects the heart. And so the Chinese have that same conception that there is a part of your psyche that protects that part that creates. And it's a very important part. And that's called pericardium yin in Chinese medicine. It's the yin part that protects you. And then that protective part, that covering, that protects your creation, also has a part that's necessary in order to sell it. In other words, you've created a painting, you put it up in a museum, and you put a price tag on it, because you also need to eat. So you want to sell it. So part of your heart, that pericardium yang, is the part of you that goes out into the world. It's the salesman. It's the part of you that connects with the rest of the human race, and with that creative part of you. So that somebody hopefully appreciates. Ultimately, I forget what it was that just sold for $100 million that somebody created in the 16th century. And they probably starved to death. But at any rate, there is that part. Now, the interesting thing is we talked about the triple burner before, and that the triple burner is responsible for harmony, and that the triple burner is part of that heart configuration. There are actually 4 parts. We'll leave the 4th part out for the moment, but it's important. But the triple burner works together with the rest of the heart, particularly with that pericardium yang. It's the charmer. I once had a father-in-law. He manufactured 90% of the world's fine paper. He was one of the richest men in America. And when he walked into a room, whatever he had to sell, you would buy. His energy was such that he owned that room. And you loved him. You just automatically loved this guy. I mean, if you didn't want to buy paper, you bought paper. And he went around the world playing golf and selling paper. And he was the vice chairman of Kimberly-Clark, which makes all your Kimbies for your babies and everything. He just had that ability. If he came into this room, he would own you. That guy had a triple burner. And he had a heart. And he graduated law school when he was 19 years old, Columbia Law School. So he was a fantastic example in my life. I learned most things, actually, a lot of things that are of value to me in Chinese medicine during World War II and since. Not so much from, I never went to school, so Chinese medical school, fortunately. At any rate, so this all works together. That part of you that's creating, the part of you that creates, that's creative, that the part that actually creates something, the part that protects that and defends it, and the part that sells it and connects to the rest of the world. And this is all the heart mind. And it balances that other logical kidney brain, which is really, I wrote a whole paper called Awareness, Science East and West on this subject, and another one on awareness. Because ultimately, your total awareness depends on how advanced this heart-mind becomes. I mean, you can study mathematics and become a great mathematician, but you're not going to be terribly aware necessarily, except what's on the chalkboard there in terms of, I'm sorry, I studied it for a year and a half and I can't remember. The equations, but if you ask that person's wife, they don't have the vaguest notion of what, she made for breakfast. So, how aware you are, this heart controls that part of the mind. And awareness is the single most important aspect of life. Every single religion, if you, well, you know a lot about Buddhism probably, but Zen Buddhism, all Buddhism, it's how awake you are that defines who you are. Freud talked about making the unconscious conscious. That was his whole psychoanalytic his whole object of his psychoanalytic work was to make what's unconscious in somebody conscious, because once they became conscious, they could do something about it. Once it was operating unconsciously, it operated them rather than operating it. But there is no religion in the world, no philosophy in the world that doesn't put awakeness and awareness. And what do they say most about somebody like Jesus? He was somebody who was so awake that he was in touch with God, which was the ultimate awakeness. But that's true in the Hindu tradition. Anywhere you turn, in any esoteric part of our existence, the most important thing is awareness. And it all resides in that heart mind, to the extent that it's developed. And what I found, and I wrote in the book, and I actually copied it here if you want me to read it, what I wrote in my book, which was a book that was about psychology and Chinese medicine, that what I discovered when I started to include Chinese medicine in the work that I was doing, which was all psychoanalysis and psychiatric, was that people became very quickly aware of things about themselves, as well as others, but mostly about themselves, that would have taken years to arrive at, going through the regular psychoanalytic system.